there, and welcome to Octocon Presents for June. This is a Pride panel telling queer stories. Explicitly queer stories haven't always been readily available for viewers and readers, particularly not those from small communities or oppressive cultures. Our panel of storytellers take up the mantle of queer heroes for the next generation to tell the stories that they couldn't hear when they were growing up. Where do their stories come from? Where do they see queer literature heading as society outgrows straight culture? And how do we get to a point where we don't need to code our characters queer and can just let them be? Hi, everyone. I'm MaryBrigid Turner. I am one of the Octocon committee and part of the program team. I am a bookseller at Hodges Figgis, Ireland's oldest bookshop. I have been working there for about 20 years now. Books have always been my passion, science fiction and fantasy in particular, and give me a good story. If the character's queer, all the better, but give me a good story. I'll now hand over to our panelists to introduce themselves. I
think that is me. So you broke up there, sorry. So hello, I am Estelle Cooper, and I am a spec author of science fiction and fantasy. And I'm very excited to be here and terrible at introductions.
Joe.
Yeah, I'm Joe Glass. I'm based in Wales. I'm a writer of comic books, specifically always LGBTQ inclusive comic books. My most well-known works being the LGBTQ plus superhero series for Pride and the anthology Young Men in Love.
I'm Kat Dodd. I am the head of program as well as accessibility officer for Octocon this year. And I am non-binary, they, them, and yeah. I can speak English most of the time. I have grown up reading and trying to find content when I was younger, especially because growing up in a very religious household and you're not allowed to be queer, and found things in fanfic that I couldn't find elsewhere. So yeah, I'm very happy that we actually have more mainstream things now than only being able to find things in fanfic.
Excellent. What actually gives us a good place to start? Where do we find these stories? Where do we find the good stories that have good representation and are a good story as well? I'll start with Dove.
I think it really depends on what you're looking for in terms of representation. If you're looking for a lot of good non-binary representation, a lot of good A-spec representation, for example, you're still mostly looking at self-published books, indie publishers, the smaller publishers that are more willing to take a risk than a lot of the big publishers. We're seeing that change. And to some extent, I think this holds true for like all queer stories, but especially like the further along you get in the spectrum. You know, I lost my train of thought. I'm doing great. But it's very much, we're starting to see that shift towards mainstream, but a lot of the really, really good stories where you get like a lot of in-depth nuanced representation, that's still kind of the domain of indie stories and self-published stories. At least is my experience.
Cool. Joe?
I've recently been discovering that there's actually a lot of really great representation in young adult novels at the moment, with some absolutely fantastic ones and some which are really challenging what kind of characters you're getting, what kind of stories and settings. And it's really awesome to see. I didn't realize that there was such a diverse and broad range in the young adult literature field at the moment that was so queer friendly. So that is fantastic. We are starting to see comics, mainstream comics, starting to pick up the ball a little bit with particularly like regular like Pride event sort of issues every year now for the last couple of years, which is awesome to see. And some of those publishers even like showing that kind of solidarity all year round, which is nice, but there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of representation of aspects of the wider LGBTQ plus community in comics. So a lot of the time, it's similar, I would say, that like in comics, you'd be looking mainly at like indie and small press and independently published titles for like some aspects of the community to still get representation now.
Excellent. Kat?
Sorry, I am pretty much in agreement with both of them. Is it does tend to be the indie, because traditional publishers, their goal is to make money, and they're going to work with what they know is going to make them money. And yes, there's a queer audience that wants these things, but for the most part, publishers can be very hesitant to take risks on something. And unfortunately, queer content is one of the things that they can be very hesitant on. So yeah, indie tends to be the way of it. Also, queer romance is a fairly solid genre that you can get whether that representation is good depends, but it is at least there.
So I suppose we should actually backtrack a bit and ask the question of, what do we actually mean by representation? Is it a side character that just so happens to be queer? Is it coded? Is it what do we actually expect from representation? We'll start with you, Joe.
For me, like if it's to be good representation, then coding is definitely not really it. You know, it needs to be explicitly and open. In terms of whether it be side characters or main characters, that could really be either, could work. Like there are plenty of stories out there where the queer characters are the the side characters of the piece, not the main protagonists, but still are really excellent examples of representation. But they're few and far between, but they're out there. For me, like when I'm sort of thinking about representation in the things which I'm making, it is about inclusivity, and that is just including us in our own narratives, and including the people who relate to us and who are our identity in the narrative itself. So for me, like that's why everything I write always includes LGBTQ characters of some description. No matter what the story is, because like I say, we're everywhere. We do get into all aspects of life, and in a world with superheroes or werewolves or whatever, like then I would assume the same would happen then. So of course I'm going to do that in any story like that I would do. So for me, like I would say for the perfect example of representation would be anything that just has us present and actually getting to interact and partake in the story.
Kat?
Yeah, I'm very much in agreement with Joe on that, especially that last line of anything that has us present and getting to partake. I also agree coding is not really representation. When it's all you can get, it's marginally better than nothing, but it's still not actually representation. Representation is explicit, whether it's explicitly said in the material or by the creators, with some exceptions on that last one. Like I use, this isn't a literature example, but I use She-Ra, Princess of Power, and Nate Stevenson as an example of this, because Nate Stevenson has said a few things about representation in the show, of all the characters are some type of queer. Entrapta is explicitly autistic representation. Even though this isn't mentioned in the canon itself, it's still very present. And I use that as the example of what I mean, of when a creator can say it and it does still count. When it is somebody, like, it's already, the books are sold and everything's done and there's no more content being created, and then the writer's like, oh yeah, this character was totally gay all along, that's when I tend to go, were they really though? Does this really count as representation? So what does representation even look like? this is me reminding myself of what the question is so I don't go completely off the rails. When it is explicit representation and when it is intentional, sometimes you don't necessarily set out to write it. Sometimes it's only when you're reading back there and you're like, yep, that's definitely there. But then it's intentional from that point on in the editing stages, and maybe you add some things in to make it more clear. I'm a big believer that characters are people and people are everything. So have those stories. And I definitely think sidekicks can be really good representation. Where it can become problematic is when the sidekicks are the only representation we're getting. So if somebody is, sorry, I need to shift around. When somebody is saying that, oh, they're totally, they write queer stories and they really try very hard to have this representation, but the only characters that are allowed to be queer in their stories are the sidekicks, that's when I tend to be, I tend to question. It's not necessarily that I doubt, I question and I challenge. So yes, that was a very long answer. I'm sorry.
It's okay. Dodd.
Well, I agree with both Joe and Kat on this. I really like also that you call that like explicit representation isn't necessarily word on page representation. It is intentional representation. And I think that for me is really the key, is it's intentional representation. Sometimes when I started reading aspec fiction, especially, I would run into books where it's like, this is ace representation. And what it would have is a tertiary character who maybe sort of mentions that they're not interested in dating. And that's it. And like, I'm sorry, but that was never really good representation. And on the other hand, we also have older representation. Like two older aspec representation books are The Protector of the Small series by Tamora Pierce, which has been confirmed as Arrow Ace protagonist later on, when Pierce learned like, oh, there's a word for what this character is. I'm going to use it. And the other one is Joe Walton's The King's Peace and The King's Name, where the main character is very much Arrow aspec coded, but it was written and published in a time before these terms were in any way widely known. But it is very clear on-page representation with multiple scenes where the characters comment on this character that is technically coded as aspec, but it's also, it's like, it's coded in a way where it's like you look back on it and you have the word and it's like, yeah, no, that works. So it's kind of like, if it's intentional, even if that intent is, as Kat pointed out, something where you like, you write it and you look back on it and you go, oh, well, that is really obvious now that I know, that still counts as representation because it's kind of subconsciously intended that way. Like we see that a lot with writers who are exploring their identity through stories, where it's like, okay, we're exploring this story and you're writing these identities because you resonate with them, but you don't necessarily understand what you're resonating with or why you're leaning that way. And then when you look back on it, it's like, oh, this is lightning bolt. And that to me at least also counts as representation, even if it wasn't intentional, where it's consciously done. If that makes any sense to people at all. So
that's so cool to hear about Tamora Pierce, because she's always been one of my favorite authors. So that's really cool that she's discovered that there's a term for what she had created those characters to be, and she's acknowledged that they are that is actually what they are. That's really cool. So does it count if as you say, the implication is there, and that that the creator is part of the community? Does that still count as representation if none of the characters themselves are explicitly queer?
For me, I think that would depend, because I don't always write books with aspec characters in them. And it's going to show up in my books because that's just, you know, how the world works for me. But when I explicitly and deliberately try to go a different route, it becomes very easy, but also very dangerous to say, oh, well, this clearly is that one experience by that author because that is what they know. It's something that I would suggest being careful with, because it is very easy to then reduce the author and what they can write or create to just that one experience.
I joke that all of my characters are some type of queer because I don't know how to write straight cis characters, but it is actually a joke. I do know how to write. I do know how to write these characters. But the part of the reason why it's a joke is because I play around with my characters. I don't just use them for one project. I play around with them just for fun. And I have one character that I've been writing off and on for like 6 or 7 years. And I was sat down to write them in a new thing. And I'm like, how did I not realize this character's non-binary? And it's things like that just crops up all the time with me. So that's why I joke that my characters aren't straight, because I don't know how to write straight characters, but I do, and some of them could actually be straight if I chose to make them straight.
I know that feeling. I've had that, and then I was like, okay, let's write a story where I have a token straight love interest, and you read it and it's like, well, damn it, this character is clearly aromantic, and I just missed it. So like I make that same joke, except sometimes it doesn't work out.
So one of the questions that we asked in the introduction was, where do we see queer literature heading as society outgrows straight culture? Does anyone have an answer for that?
I think we're seeing it enter the mainstream a lot more. Not just like in the world of comics, as I mentioned earlier, but like also look at things like the popularity of Heartstopper as a TV show, and how that's led then through the success of that to Netflix looking to produce other shows, which are, well, the combination of that and is it Young Royals, which the success of those shows made them look for other kind of stories like that. So now we're going to get Red, White, and Red, White, and Blue.
Red, White, and Royal Blue.
Yeah, Red,
White,
White,
and Royal Blue. So like we're going to get new sort of content like that. So we're going to see more of it in the mainstream. The difficulty is it's still very much a case of mainstream television media, and we're probably going to be hopefully in books and literature and comics as well, but film still feels very much like a long way off. Like the way that any films which involve any kind of explicit queer representation are handled or treated as just like sort of quirky little small cinema things, as opposed to mainstream. And when you do have mainstream cinema looking at queer characters, it's almost immediately sort of review bombed and things like that. So it's still a long way off in some mediums, but we are seeing it in a lot of media becoming more mainstream, and I think that's where we're seeing things going, which is really important because, like, say, right now, I think that is a really beneficial thing to have when things have been getting increasingly difficult for LGBTQ plus people again, and a particularly scary time. So to see ourselves sort of getting into the mainstream a bit more, and how that might give more people who maybe think they've never met a queer person in their life to suddenly feel like they're getting interactions with queer people through this content. That is the kind of thing we need. It's like that's one of the ways in which media can help change the narrative. So,
anyone else?
I would add to that that we are going to probably see mainstream media grow in queer representation through stages, because I'm sure we all remember like the 90s and before then, where if you had like a queer gay person, it was very much the stereotypical effeminate gay, and if it wasn't that, it wasn't in the the stories. And we're moving now towards more explicit gay representation, where it's like we have gay romance, which is great. But as we can see from like the reaction to films like The Half of It, mainstream media is still a fair bit away from having nuance, because The Half of It got a lot of backlash for being a story about a lesbian and her himbo friend rather than a lesbian romance, which it did have in there. Like, it was very clearly a lesbian story. It was very clearly advertised as this is not a romance. People had the backlash anyway, because we want that very explicit romantic representation right now. And that is something where it's going to be, this is what we're going to get for a while. And from there, we're going to build out into more nuanced narratives. And that's just something that I've noticed, at least, is we're building towards that in stages.
Kind of along the same lines, I think that a lot of the time sexuality can be very sexualized by straight people, and content isn't okay for children because to them it's automatically sexual when it isn't, and it shouldn't be. And if you challenge it, they will actually think about it. If you challenge it and are like, okay, but like, why is your sexuality acceptable for children? Because it's not sexualized, is it? Okay, why is ours? So people just have these gut reactions to things, and when they're challenged on it, they do actually think about it. But so that's part of why people expect the romance to be part of it, because it's queer, so therefore it's sexual, right? No.
I think it's
I
think it's definitely, that's a huge part of it, but I think it's also because we need that visibility. Like, if it's queer romance, it is very undeniably visible, and I think that is something that is, especially in this climate, also very important. Like, we need all the stories, but with the climate that we're in, I think just visibility to, is just really important.
Yeah, no, I totally agree on that. I think that also where we're going to wind up is when, because like you both were saying, it is getting more mainstream, and 20 odd years ago when I was a teenager, it was very much this, when you could find it, which is a big if and when you could find it, it was always sequestered away in its own little corner of the library and the bookshops. So like, this is the queer area, except they didn't call it queer. But anyway, this is the area to find these, and like, you had to write specifically for this area, and now it really is more mainstream, and it's not sequestered to its own little corner. It's mixed in along everything else, except during Pride Month, when we get to show off all of the things.
Or when
and I think it's going to continue in that direction.
Or when you have like a nice queer friendly bookstore or film store where they're like, we're going to have a special shelf for this so it's easy to find, and it's not like we're going to put it away in a corner where you can't find it. It's like, we're going to put this front and center so it's very easy to find.
But it is very true that it is becoming more acceptedly mainstream. I mean, 10 years ago when I was setting up a Pride display, I was struggling to find 10 to 15 books to fill out a fabric unit. The last couple of years, I'm struggling to decide what titles am I going to put on the 2 or 3 tables that we've got, because I have to make a decision between what am I going to put on the table, whereas years ago I was struggling to find them. But that kind of also leads us nicely to, how do we get to that point where we can tell a story that isn't just a romance? We can just let the queer character be queer. How do we get to that? How do we get to that point?
I suppose like the easiest way is just to do it. Is like, for the longest time with my own work, like, or my own desires, was wanting to see, like, obviously in superhero comics, LGBTQ characters, and for going years without seeing any, or at least what little examples there were all very much one-dimensional. That was kind of what prompted me to start making my books. And whenever anyone asks that sort of question, I think like that is really the only answer that it is. Like, is you just need to do it, and you need to sort of put it out there. And the more people who are doing that and being like, right, well, here's the story I want to see. Maybe other people want to see it too, so I'm going to start writing it. I'll get it out there somehow. The more that becomes out there, the more mainstream starts taking notice, the more mainstream realizes, hopefully, hey, there's an audience here, and start looking into catering for it too. And like I say, that's how we get to a point then where it just becomes more of a norm, is just to make it happen, which sounds super dismissive, and super like, oh, make it sound way easier than it is, but it is unfortunately just kind of, in my mind, is the way these things happen. You just have to make them happen.
That's a very good point.
I push the question back on people when they ask, like, what purpose to the plot does your character serve by being queer? And I'm just like, okay, but what purpose to the plot does your character serve by being straight?
Exactly.
When you start having to justify your characters, I'll justify mine. But until that point, if you don't have to justify your straight white male characters, I'm not going to justify mine that deviates from that.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that, Dodd?
No, I agree completely with everything that was said. It's I would say maybe add to what Joe said, with just because we creators can only do so much. We need support, and sometimes what you see, especially around things like Pride Month, is you get lots of people. They're lovely people. They love making lists of, these are like really cool Pride books, and here's a list of 10 characters that are non-binary, and they're all going to be trad pub, which is great. Support trad pub, but maybe also consider supporting the people who are trying to push the boundaries of what we can do and what nuance we get to see in the books as well.
So that leads me nicely into, do we have any favorites that we would have considered good representation back in the day, but might now be problematic for any reason, that we would still want to recommend? Or if they're problematic, do we forget about them completely?
I think one which comes to mind for myself is A Game of You from The Sandman by Neil Gaiman, and the many artists involved. And that one features some trans representation, and like some of the earliest trans representation in comic books. And yes, it's very dated in how it's handled, and how we would do it now is nowhere near how it was done back then. But it's one of those things where it's not because of any maliciousness, it's not because of not willing to go and learn things, but because the language wasn't 100% there, or the discussion of identity, of our identity representation hadn't got to that point yet. It was a product of its time. But personally, I think, and obviously I'm very much aware, but I'm saying this as a non-trans person, but it still reads as great representation to me because of how it discusses identity and the impermanence of identity. And that, for me, I think is very powerful, because once it's one of those lessons I felt that I took from that story as a younger reader, that made me realize how that means that identity, just because you're one thing now doesn't mean you have to be that thing forever, and that impermanence of identity is very, and flexibility of it is very important to understand, is that change is possible in all people. And that's, for me, like I say, is something which I would say is nowadays perhaps not considered the best representation, but I think it's still very good and very useful. So it's one I would still recommend to anyone.
That's cool. stuff?
This is such a loaded question. I'm trying to think of what would be like the best option to mention here, because most of my experience, as you probably gathered from my responses, is an A-spec representation, and we don't have that much old explicit representation. Like the oldest I can think of, I actually would not recommend nowadays. So I'm going to say Quicksilver by R.J. Anderson. Okay. This is a young adult book that came out in about 2012. And the main character is explicitly asexual. And it is lovely, great representation that explores like, okay, what does this mean for this character? And what does this mean for her relationships? And there's an entire story about how being asexual doesn't make her like an alien, which you can get in older stories like this. But then at the very end, like in the last chapter or something, it does this complete 180 into, oh, and now there's romance because it needs a romantic ending because it's a young adult novel.
Yeah.
And it's like, it was great and lovely, but this comes completely out of nowhere. It is not built up. It is clearly not supposed to be in here. And that is something that, when it comes to older A-spec representation, is something that you do tend to see, is there tends to be at some point a pivot into, okay, well, you need romance. Okay, well, you need to, be sexualized. Because that is something that at the time they were published needed to be done. You can see that even in the oldest representation, which I think off the top of my head is the Vows and Honor series by Mercedes Lackey. It is very problematic representation. Don't read it for it, but it is explicitly mentioned in the introduction that Tarma is asexual. Just if you do pick it up, be warned, it comes with like a million trigger warnings for everything. It did not age well.
No.
Yeah, Mercedes Lackey is an example that a lot of people cite as it was well-intentioned for its time, but problematic.
That pretty much sums it up, yeah.
Pat and myself were actually talking about that the other night, and to the best of my memory, it's one of the first examples, well, certainly the Valdemar series, the beginnings of the Valdemar series, was one of the first examples of gay representation, explicit gay representation with strong romantic, not necessarily always healthy when you look back at them, but storylines. But have all of her books aged well? No. Is she someone that I would still recommend? Possibly. But it would depend on the situation and what the person was looking for. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend her these days for the gay representation. I would recommend it for a good story.
Which I think is also a good thing to think about is, does representation, sorry, my words just got tangled all of a sudden. Good representation isn't just good representation. Good representation exists inside of a good story that you're going to recommend for the story as well.
That is a very good point.
Very good point. So are we more accepting of gay characters that we can just, queer characters, that we can just let them be, or without it necessarily being a major part of their story? Or do we still have a long way to go? Can it just be a part of their story? Or does it have to be the major part, the only thing you know about them?
I think we definitely need stories but where it's not the only thing we know about them. Because if anything, that's not good character. If the only thing you know about them is who they like to date. we would need like a well-rounded character and be able to know other things about them. In terms of, do we need all our queer representation stories to be centered around the queer representation? I'd say no. I think things are already starting to move away from that. Like there was a book I read, I think it was towards the end of last year, it might be early this year, which I thoroughly enjoyed, called Timberdark, and Wranglestone is the first one, I think, actually, which is a post-apocalypse story, but there is a male-male romance in there, but it's not about them being two guys. The society that they have built up in this zombie apocalypse world is, no one cares. Like, no one makes a big deal out of the fact that they're two guys who like each other or anything once, and they're just allowed to be, and like that was fine, and it didn't come out as feeling wrong or weird or anything like that. I think if you were telling a story set in a very real modern world, then perhaps you would still need to have them face some of the challenges that we face. Like, I love Heartstopper, but like it is very much fantasy. Like the fact they get very little pushback for their relationship and their identities as queer people is lovely, but also not accurate. And it, as much as, you know, we should have stories which are about joy and not about, you know, constant misery, sometimes you have got to be a little honest, and I think that it would be nice to see that. It does look like we will get that in little elements, and certainly in the next season now, it's going to involve a section in the books which would have the bit of that. So that's going to be interesting to see how they handle that in the TV show. But I do think that generally we are already at that stage where it doesn't have to be about their queerness. They can just be queer. And if anything, that's really useful. But as well as that, I think we're also at that stage where we're still going to see a lot of stories which focus on the queerness of their lives, their culture, their society, how they look at the world differently because of their queerness. And that is, I think, very useful at this present time, because I think that's where a lot of the difficulties and the dangers that we're seeing in society right now is because of our society being so othered, and our culture being so othered. So we would sometimes, as much as, you know, we might say, oh, it doesn't always have to be about us being queer, it is useful to have those stories right now, because hopefully it can make people who are not part of the community realize that actually we may look at things different. We may have different social settings and different cultural reference points, but we're not that different. That, you know, we're not alien. Like, we are absolutely people just like everyone else. So I think there's a mix of both at the moment, I guess, is where I'm getting at here, and I think both are useful right now.
Yeah, so I 100% agree with that. It's because I've seen that mix as well, and sometimes you even get that mix within the same book. Like Eliot de Bodar's The Red Scholar's Wake is very much a book. You can read it as a straight space opera that happens to have a queer romance in it, or you can read it as a queer romance that happens to be set in a space opera. Kind of depends on how you read it. Either way, it's awesome, but you know,
it's you need to read it.
You do. It's really good. It's but yeah, no, it's that was roughly the first book I thought of with this question, was like, there's a good example. And you know, another good example would be Kaya Sondersby, Failure to Communicate. This is about a bisexual autistic main character, and the character just happens to be bisexual. It's just there, and the autism is a huge part of the plot of that book, because that is what the author wanted to explore at the time. And So it's very much a case of, we have these books. We have books that are explicitly about this experience. We have books that are explicitly about the fact that, yeah, our lives can really suck. And we need to acknowledge that. And then we have the books like Heartstopper, which are like, but this is what we would like our lives to be, because we would like to be happy and just live our lives without being harassed by anyone, please and thank you.
Exactly.
Because we're people, we deserve that. And that's why both sides of the spectrum for me are so important. Is it is affirming to a queer person, depending on what they're looking for. If you're looking for something that affirms that, yeah, your life can suck, we have stories like that. If you need the escapism of, and I want to see what it looks like if my life did not have this in it, we have that. If you want to see, get that awareness to non-queer people, they can look at those stories too and get what they need out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Any thoughts on that, Kat?
I agree with both Joe and Dove, like 1,000%.
So do you have any recent favorite examples that you'd, other than your own works, that you'd like to share, and maybe tell us a little bit about why they've done it well, why their representation is good?
I have absolutely fallen in love this year with the works of TJ Klune, who, as near as I can tell, I'm still very much working my way through his books. But nearly every book is queer in some way or has some sort of queer inclusion. And the big ones I would really recommend would be the Extraordinaries trilogy, which is a fantastic young adult series about superheroes, which is still actually something you very rarely see in a non-comic setting. So that's quite nice in and of itself. But the lead character, as well as being gay, is also autistic, specifically ADHD on the spectrum. And it's really fantastically done. And it was nice to see that representation there and so well handled, and how his ADHD was very much as big a part of a character defining trait for him as being a gay boy. So like that was nice to see. And the other book of his which I read this year was Wolf Song, which is aimed at somewhat older audience, I'd say. It's weird, I think it was marketed as young adult when I picked it up. It was in the young adult section, but I think it is the older end of young adult personally, because it reads a lot more like a Charlaine Harris novel.
Okay.
And it's basically hot, sexy werewolves. And it was again, very odd core relationship in it. It's very complicated, but also reads like a True Blood book or something, but really beautifully done. Like it was quite lyrical in how it's written. So but I would recommend a lot of these books by TJ Klune. And I hear a lot of the rest of his work is absolutely amazing, and I'm very much looking forward to discovering that myself.
Fantastic. Dove.
First, Joe, have you heard of the Sidequick Squad by JP Lee? No, CB Lee, sorry.
I have not, but that's another one.
If you like, if you like young adult superheroes outside of comic books, definitely check that one out, because awesome. Every book in that series takes a different queer main character and builds on the story that was done before. So don't start with like book 3 and expect to follow along, because it will not work. But it's lovely. Like the first book is about a bisexual. I can't remember the ethnicity exactly. I'm sorry about that, but that is a big element as well. The second book has a Black trans main character. The third has an Era Ace character who is Latina. And there is a fourth that is coming out eventually, I think. But just hearing you talk about that, I was like, I have to make sure you know about this series.
Awesome, fantastic. I look forward to checking that one out.
Well, I hope you enjoy it, because the book I actually want to mention is I forgot the title because I'm terrible. Little Thieves by Margaret Owen. It's this is a book where two of the leads are aspec, but it's a book where the author had to go onto Twitter to explain to people how this is indeed a demisexual romance, even though it doesn't conform to the expected pattern, because it takes place over a period of like 2 weeks, which can be enough for a demisexual person to develop, sexual/romantic attraction. And that is what happens in this book. But a lot of readers are like, well, they're not spending time around each other for 6 months. That person can't be demisexual, which is very frustrating when you're trying to like write your own experiences, which, as far as I know, Margaret Owen was trying to do. On top of that, it is a retelling of The Goose Girl. And fairy tale retellings, especially queer fairy tale retellings, are kind of my jam. And I'm very, very jealous because I could never write a Goose Girl retelling that amazing. And yeah, it's a really fun, really good book. And it's very much the kind of intentional explicit representation where it's not on page mentioned, but if you resonate with these experiences and you know it's that kind of representation, and it's just a fun book.
I've been looking at that a lot because of the cover is just so gorgeous. I'm definitely moving it up onto the further up on the TBR.
Okay, so fun fact, there is also a sequel called Painted Devils that came out recently.
Ooh.
I have not read that yet because I am a terribly slow reader nowadays, but keep that in mind.
And Kat, do you have any?
Yes. So Morgan Daimler is an expert on quite a few things dealing with Irish history and lore and that type of thing. And they recently published, I think they said it's their very first fiction book that they've published. And it's called Into Shadows. And it is very found family, very, very queer, poly, like it's all the representation I wanted when I was younger and couldn't find. So I'm very excited about it. I'm very excited to plug a new author. Oh. I mean, they're not a new author, but a new to fiction author.
So that leads me on to asking, is coded representation all bad? Does it always have to be explicit, or is coded representation better than nothing at all?
It depends on the context, I think. I personally prefer when things are a little bit more explicit, because I think we're finding with audiences these days, when you look at the way people discuss some things online, subtlety is going way over people's heads. And so sometimes like coding isn't enough, because it would seem that no matter how ham-fistedly you code something, people would just be like, oh, well, we never said it. So it's kind of very hard right now, because I would say that there is definitely shows out there which heavily coded characters to be certain identities, but never explicitly said it, but they still work very well as fantastic representation. I'm thinking mainly like in like TV shows than I am in books at the moment. But generally, I would say that personally, and I'm fully aware that this is a personal preference, I would prefer things to be more explicit, because I feel like we need it to be. But I will also admit that depending on the context, coding can work. It's just not my personal preference.
I think it also depends on like how do you even how do you even define explicitly stated, and how like I'm going to talk about Power Rangers movie from like 2017, I think it was 2016. Because Power Rangers, that movie actually had a lot of confirmed firsts in it. Billy was the first autistic superhero in a movie, like actually explicitly stated to have autism, which is fantastic. Also, we probably should have gotten this before 2016, just saying. Trini is the first explicitly mentioned queer superhero. And the reason I bring this up is because she doesn't actually say it. They're sitting around the campfire talking about themselves, and somebody asks Trini, like, boy trouble, and she just shakes her head, and they go, oh, girl trouble? And she uses body language. I don't actually remember exactly what, but she uses body language that basically says yes, but she doesn't actually want to talk about it. So is it explicitly stated? No, but is it explicit? Like, I'd consider that explicit confirmation.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
But I also deal with a lot of people when I bring it up, and they're like, but that's not explicit, that's not, and I'm like, but it is. Like, just because you would rather her say, oh yeah, I'm super queer, doesn't mean that she isn't confirming that she's not straight.
It reminds me it reminds me a lot of some of the discussions that were going around on Tumblr when Yuri on Ice came out. Because Yuri on Ice is a gay ice skating drama. And there is one scene, mild spoilers, there's one scene in the middle of the season where you see the two main characters, the main character and his love interest, run towards each other and come together, and there is a heavy implication of kissing. But you don't actually see them. You don't actually see the kiss. So what happened is a lot of fans went on Tumblr, like, they redrew this frame to show without any kind of doubt that their heads were so close together, there was no other way. This was specifically a kiss, because the implication wasn't enough. There's an entire drama around Yuri on Ice and whether or not you can read Yuri as demisexual or if he's allosexual gay, but that's an entirely different story. But again, it's why explicit representation can be really important, especially I think if it is something that is even remotely mainstream, because once you get to a mainstream point where a lot of people will see it, any kind of nuance that you might have had in there is going to be lost if you don't state it explicitly. People are going to run with it, which in one way is great. It's amazing. I love that. And the other, if you're specifically writing or creating something for the representation and it goes mainstream, you need to make sure that people understand the representation is there, because in the mainstream, a lot of people don't have the shorthand, they don't have the lingo, they don't understand what is going on. They need the extra push.
That's a very interesting point. It's like, if our end goal is a wider acceptance of queer characters, then any kind of blurring of those lines is not a good thing.
Yes and no, I think. It's blurring of the lines is good, because if we don't blur the lines, we lose a lot of nuance that is really important. It's why we have non-binary and gray ace spectrums. Those are a spectrum because they're blurry. We don't necessarily know where we fall. There's no clear straight line between, okay, this is a demigirl, this is not a demigirl, this is something else entirely. We don't have that. But sometimes when it comes to representation, especially if it's very still like a very unknown identity, it can be helpful to draw some broader boundaries, because it helps people understand what it is. The downside of doing that is that becomes all it is, and that's why we need the blurring and we need the nuance. But we also need the firm lines, because otherwise people are going to be like, yeah, wait, I don't understand this. It's give and take. It's a balance, and it's very frustrating because there's no right answer here.
That's a very good point.
With me and reading fanfic and stuff, and one of the things that I enjoy in fanfic is when they do gender swaps, because that's just really interesting to me of how things are how things are the same and how things are different and how they intersect and stuff like that. Where it gets frustrating is when people try to do gender swaps of Tamara Pierce books. Because when you are trying to gender swap something that is already subverting traditional gender roles, it does not work.
Yeah.
And I think that type of thing can happen when we don't define things of like Deb was saying, of having to define the lines, because when things go mainstream, the fans who don't understand the nuance lose the nuance.
Yeah,
so
that's a very good point. Well, it looks like we are coming to the end of our time. I could quite easily continue talking about this with you guys for another hour or more. But just to remind everybody, Octocon is happening this year in the 7th and 8th of October at the Gibson Hotel. We are the National Irish... And online, yes, and online. We are the National Irish Science Fiction Convention. Our website, octocon.com. So I'll just pass over to my lovely panelists to, if you can give us a little closing statement and maybe recommend something of your own, either that you're working on or coming up with, or yeah, starting with you, Joe.
Yeah, so people can find me online pretty much everywhere. The big one being my website, joeglasscomics.co.uk, where they can sign up to my newsletter for the latest news. There's a web store for buying any of my independent stuff and some of the apparel, which I design as well. The next big thing for me is The Miracles, which is coming out in comic shops in October. So people can pre-order now. They just need to go to their local comic shop and say, I'd really like to get The Miracles, and that'd be awesome. Miracles is about a superhero family drama about a kid who discovers he's got superpowers, and he discovers down to the family secret that his family are refugees from a comic book living now in the real world. And basically it's about family secrets and what we sort of keep from each other. So yeah, it's a nice little drama. It's going to be a 4-issue mini series. And that's kind of the next big thing for me now.
Fantastic. Go.
You can find me basically anywhere where you can find Dublin Writer. So my website is dublinwriter.com. I am not active on Twitter at the moment, and I'm very bad at finding social media that works for me, but that's roughly where you can still find me. Let's see. I am trying very hard to fight my brain and actually finish a science fiction short story collection that I'm working on that is very queer and is basically Star Trek, but what if we have aspec representation in it? And but for things you can actually read, especially given the conversations that we had, I would say The Ice Princess is a Fair Illusion, which is a novel in verse retelling of King Thrushbeard. And it has a lot of conversations about different takes on queer identity and the use of labels and explicit versus implicit representation and that kind of thing.
Oh,
I would read the heck
sounds
out
amazing.
of that.
That sounds amazing. Joe, before I forget, I believe you've got a Kickstarter?
Sorry, yes. Yeah, I'm currently running a Kickstarter as well. It's actually the first new content for the Pride since we did the Pride Omnibus, which came out in 2021, which collected a series. So it's the first new story since 2019. And it's also just loads of pin-ups and just queer joy in summertime vibes. The Pride Summer Special. We're fully funded and well past it. There's only about 10 days left. But yeah, if you want to check it out, head over to Kickstarter. It's actually their recommended campaign today as well. But yeah, head over to Kickstarter and look for the Pride Summer Special. That is also currently something big which I'm working on at the moment.
Fantastic. And what about yourself, Kat?
Okay, so now that I'm saying this, I have to actually have it like ready to go. So I guess, like, you know, knock on wood and all that. I'm working on a few things that I'm hoping to have actually ready at Octocon this year.
Cool.
One of them is for Cup on Fae, the writing group that Paul and myself and our friend Helen run together. We put out anthologies as we can. One year we got a little bit too overzealous, and also with the pandemic and everything, a bunch of us just kind of got burnt out, not because of the anthologies, but just in general burnt out by life. And I'm one of the people that got burnt out by life. So the current project is Trans Little Mermaid in Space.
Nice.
So I'm really excited about that. And I've been wanting to write this story for like since 2019. So I'm finally sitting down to actually write this story, and I'm excited about it. And now that I've said it, I have to have it ready at Octocon. Like, we know how this works, right?
Yeah.
And then the other one is another one that I've been working on. I actually had it written and sat on it for like a year before I typed it into my computer, and then sat on it for another year before I started it. And it is very found family, very queer, and dealing with ghosts and all kinds of fun stuff like that. So, yes.
Excellent. Well, once again, thank you to my lovely panelists. This has been a fantastic evening. Octocon will be happening on 7th and 8th of October in person at the Gibson Hotel and online. You can check out our website for any further information, and lots of our guests have already been announced. And we look forward to seeing people there. Thanks very much.
Bye.